This is the true to
The
life
night the
inspired
ordinary
story
became
of a
impossible
one-woman
began with a
sorority who broke the
mistaken
bind of
reservation
Billionaire
and a
and
man
got
who
together.
wanted to be invisible. Picture New York in late autumn, thick air, wet leaves clinging to gutters, and the kind of cold that makes people hurry past one another without a word. Graham Westwood stepped out of a borrowed Honda and tucked an aging diaper bag under his arm like a prop in a play he'd been memorizing for months. He was wearing jeans he hadn't worn in years and a t-shirt that said nothing about the skyline he owned. He did it on purpose. For 32 years, the world had known Graham Westwood as numbers, boardrooms, headlines. He was the man on magazine covers and the man who could sign a check that changed a county. But there was another headline no one wrote. A man who had learned how to survive loss alone, who had learned to lie to protect his girls from his own grief. A man who had buried a wife and then buried the part of himself that believed in ordinary conversation. He'd booked a blind date, but he'd also booked something else, the experiment of anonymity. Could a human being look at him and only see a man trying to buckle two booster seats? Could someone laugh with his girls without seeing dollar signs? That question sat in his chest like an ache. The hostess led him to table 5. It was by the window, the city spilling past in blurred gold. Two girls with curls and crayons settled into booth cushions as if they always belonged to rooms like that. He smoothed his palms, practiced small talk. He checked the door. No date. A small humiliation warmed up inside his throat. The app had ghosted him. Then the door opened in a way that made the world tilt. A woman walked in carrying a tote, a paperback sticking out the top, hair pulled back with a loose, practical clip. She scanned, came straight to table 5, and sat because she believed the reservation was hers. Her name, she said, was Sadie Quinn. The girl squealed. He felt relief and sudden terror. Sadie did not have the posture of someone used to being viewed. She had the posture of someone used to listening. Her cardigan smelled faintly of lavender. Her face, open, edged with small lines made by laughter and worry, was the kind of face that did not show up in magazine layouts. She greeted the twins like a neighbor greeting stray cats, softly, like a small mercy. She drew a cat on a napkin and the girls collapsed with delight. Graham learned in those 5 seconds that happiness had a frequency he'd forgotten how to hear. When plates arrived, when marinara took down one child's arm and juice toppled across the table, Sadie did something simple. She stayed. She laughed when the spaghetti made a small disaster. She told a story about face-planting into a bakery cake as a child and then asked the girls, curiously, what their magic rock did. She did not ask what company he ran or how many houses he owned. She asked about the color of crayons. Then the check arrived. Graham's practiced hand went to his back pocket and came away empty. It was a moment that could have snapped the spell. He could have called a driver, made an excuse, used influence. Instead, Sadie quietly reached into her worn wallet and paid, as if covering a small debt of decency. She said it was fine because sometimes people needed a break. I watched the way she moved, a small, defiant kindness, like an instrument resetting the key of the world. After she left, I found the napkin drawing under his arm, a cat with too many whiskers and a lopsided heart. For the first time in a long while, something inside him loosened. He drove home thinking of small, fragile things, a child's paper, the tilt of her smile, and the question that had irritated him for years softened into something else. Maybe what he wanted wasn't anonymity. Maybe it was simply the permission to be seen as a man, not a headline. That night, he didn't check stock prices. He smoothed the napkin again and folded it into the book he'd been keeping since his wife died. Pages of memory now punctuated by a child's crude cat. He fell asleep with the paper in his hand, the city humming outside, like an expectation.
The red door was not dramatic in some neighborhoods. A red door was merely a marker. But the Pine Street Library's red door was a promise. It meant books, story hours, community tables where people sat and did not rush. Graham went there because she'd told him so. When she'd said red door, he thought it was a small throwaway detail. He'd been wrong. It was a hinge. Inside, the scent of old pages and lemon polish wrapped around him. It felt almost holy. Kids were arranged like a miniature audience. A woman sat in the center with a picture book, animating voices as if she were conjuring entire worlds. Her name tag read, Sadie. He learned that in the quiet that stretched between the pages. She noticed him in a way none of his usual dates had noticed him, by watching how he watched the girls. The minute he stepped into that circle of sound, the world's noise fell back. The library's clock kept its slow, safe rhythm. When she recognized him, Sadie paused, then closed the book as though a small private ritual had been shared. Her expression was not schadenfreude or curiosity. It was that rare thing called steadiness. The conversation began awkwardly, the man who had been every headline and the woman who had remained unremarkable to the world. She asked how he liked the story. He answered, truthfully, "I'd forgotten how a good story can make a room feel bigger." She introduced him to children like she introduced them to warmth. Low, simple, not a show. She knew their names. She remembered small details about their lives. He observed the way respect moved between them. He watched a woman who had chosen to center other people's light. It unsettled and calmed him at once. Outside, the neighborhood felt different, less anonymous. He told himself he'd come to say thanks, then leave. Instead, he stayed until closing, holding a paper cup of tea, listening, trying to learn what he'd lost. He left with a different kind of ache, a longing for ordinary presence, for someone who would be the opposite of the glass room he inhabited. He also left with another, more practical thing, the address of a woman who fed children stories and left people better than she found them. When he told people who Sadie Quinn was, they assumed he'd flirted with a cause, a classic Billionaire's charity story. It wasn't like that. That's the dangerous part about headlines. They flatten the lines between real life and spectacles. Sadie worked in that library because she loved being where stories lived. She was also a part-time volunteer at the animal shelter and an enthusiastic amateur gardener, jobs that required patience, not PR. The first time he said her name in public at a charity meeting, the room recalibrated. Someone made a joke about dating down, and laughter followed like a single disposable cloth. He had to attend to business moments later, but a fissure had formed. For the first time, he felt two lives tugging at him, the life in glass towers and the life with crayons on a kitchen table. He tried not to bring his daughters into his corporate persona. He failed. The girls started talking about Story Hour and Miss Sadie at breakfast, which dissolved something in him every morning before the sun even rose. At night, he reread The Napkin Cat and thought about the weird, quiet courage it takes to be generous, with no one watching. He began to check the library's schedule, not as a man checking a market, but as someone timetabling joy. When he entered the room now, it felt like a small act of worship. He would sit at the back and pretend to be there for the edges. He would listen to how she read about foxes and midnight trains, and he would measure the way people leaned toward her voice like it issued safety. One evening, after Story Hour, he stayed to help put books back on shelves. He handed a volume to a small hand and watched how she guided a child's fingers to the spine. It made him want to be better at the simplest of things, a better father, a better neighbor. He was learning that sometimes the cost of attention is no money at all, just time and fidelity. And so he learned her real name, not just the headline version, but the small biography she wore, rescued dog named Poppy, mother who taught her to plant marigolds, a vegan stew recipe that warmed the bottom rung of the soup pot. He learned that humility is not an absence of ambition, but a choice of where to plant your ambition. That knowledge began to rearrange him.
You cannot live in the world and not be seen. The speed of pictures is exponential.
A patron took a candid photo of Sadie walking hand in hand with the twins. It was innocent, a casual documentary of small delights. A stranger posted it to a feed. The algorithm did the rest. By morning, the photo hummed through the city. A woman in a cardigan with children skipping, a caption asking, "Who is she?" Paparazzi have a way of turning humanity into currency. Within 48 hours, the quiet of the library gave way to the noise of microphones. Sadie sat in her apartment and watched her life become a topic assigned to rooms full of people who specialized in outrage. A major donor called the library director asking for an explanation. The director, trying to tether ethics and funding, put her on leave pending review. Sadie was stunned. "She's punishing me for being human," she told no one. Across town, Graham watched the spiral on his phone and felt a small panic that had nothing to do with press. He saw the way sadness crawled across her face when a camera lens pushed through her doorway. He imagined a child waiting at the after-school table and a donor threatening to pull funds because of cliches. He had long ago used money to control risk. Now he felt the ancient ache of power, watching a life be misread. He went to her building and stood before her door, a man who could buy silence, who had bought many things, but he did not use those things. He just knocked. This night, she did not open. She said later that she had wanted to protect a job that meant more than money and a quiet rhythm she'd earned by years of service. She remembered the napkin cat and the way children believed in small miracles. She also remembered how fragile that belief is. He left, and she stayed behind her red door, folding apology letters that had not been requested. Outside, the wind pulled at dead leaves, and the city felt unjust. There is a grammar to forgiveness. It rarely begins with a press conference. It begins at a doorstep, with crayons and a child's insistence. The twins, who had no understanding of public spectacle, drew another cat and a big purple heart and slipped it under Sadie's door. They wanted their friend back. Children do not parse agendas, they only measure warmth. When Sadie opened the door and found two sticky-fingered faces and a man standing quietly behind them, something in the tension between outrage and tenderness broke. The girls burst forward and hugged her without hesitation. She sat down on the floor and let them, and for a moment the world reduced itself to breath and small hands. A neighbor happened to photograph that too, and somehow that photo traveled slower. It arrived in homes like a benediction. Graham did not make speeches. He did not issue statements. He stood behind them, letting the scene speak. Later, he would say that his heart had been held hostage by his own fears. He had worried about headlines and donors, but in the doorway, no reporters, no flashing lights. He understood what the girls had always known. Protection is not control. Protection is presence. She came back to work, quietly. The director apologized to her in a note that said more than policy language. The donor reversed his threat when he saw a small program's value could not be measured as easily as a media narrative. It was messy. It was perfect. They began again, not with a staged reconciliation, but with lunch dates in the library courtyard and story nest meetings where the twins taped paper crowns to preschoolers and Sadie sang off-key and perfect. For Graham, those small rituals unstitched something that years of success had tacked tight. For Sadie, it was a lesson in the cost of trust and the reward of taking risk on ordinary kindness. That night, they sat together on a bench outside the red door and let the city go by. He unfolded the napkin cat and pressed it into his palm. "Thank you," he said simply. She laughed, and the sound was like a small bell. "No," she said. "Thank you for keeping the door open."
He invited them to his late mother's cottage, not to impress, but to be real. It was easier to be real in a place that smelled of lemon soap and old wood. That kind of house keeps memories gentle. The twins ran through rooms like they were rediscovering a fairy tale. There was no gold, no empire at the edges, only a table with uneven legs and mismatched plates. They cooked spaghetti together. He tried to reach for pretense and failed because there's nothing to pretend when a child asks for more sauce. Sadie moved in the kitchen with a practical grace. She taught Ella to roll meatless meatballs with gentleness. She showed Emma how to twirl spaghetti without losing it through her fingers. There was an ease to her instruction. She measured time in tastes and smiles. After dinner, the twins put on a puppet show of their own creation. Sadie narrated, giving voices to sock puppets made from dish towels. Graham, who had negotiated billion-dollar deals, watched how the small audience lit up and felt dizzy with gratitude. He felt a tenderness like a light pried open. They walked in the garden under a sky that had the cold clarity of late autumn. Sadie told him about Poppy, the dog she'd rescued, and about nights she'd stayed up making sure a neighbor's cat had water in a winter without electricity. "Animals are honest," she said. "They don't ask for more than you can give, but they also teach you to keep promises." He told her about his late wife in a way he hadn't told anyone, about the smell of rain on her hair, the hush of her voice reading a book he'd never finished, the small domestic tragedies that, together, had become a life. He told her how he had learned to hide grief in work, and how that hiding had nearly tipped him into solitude. She answered with a simplicity that did not minimize him. "Grief is a kind of weather," she said. "Sometimes you build shelter. Sometimes you sit in it and listen until it passes." It was not a platitude. It was an instruction. On the porch, he took the tiny rope ring the twins had made and placed it in her apron pocket, a small private offering. He did not kneel, not yet. There was no need for one spectacular gesture. The promise was the company of many small mornings, story time, tomato stains on shirts, a dog who liked too many people. He promised, without drama, to try at ordinary things, to change diapers at night, to cook a meal, to be a man who was present. She listened and asked only one question. "If we try this, will you let the world shrink down to this house sometimes?" He said yes. She smiled like a candle deciding to burn. They fell asleep that night to the distant hum of city lights. He felt for the first time that the wrong table, the table that had been booked by mistake, might have been the table they'd been meant to sit at all along. It started with a photograph. Not the kind you keep framed on a piano, but the kind that escapes your life and doesn't come back. A man and a woman holding hands, 2 children between them, laughing, a red library door in the background, glowing like a symbol of something innocent. By dawn, that photo wasn't a memory, it was a headline. Billionaire's secret companion revealed. Who is the mystery woman with Westwood twins? Cinderella or opportunist? The internet did what it does best. It built a narrative from fragments and turned tenderness into spectacle. Every gesture was analyzed, every smile dissected. The love that had grown in quiet corners was now forced into a fluorescent light. Sadie awoke that morning to the sound of her phone vibrating like an alarm she didn't remember setting. Messages, missed calls, unknown numbers. She scrolled and saw her face everywhere. Photos from the library, from her walk home, even one through her apartment window. The captions didn't speak about kindness or story hour or the little girls who adored her. They spoke about wealth, ambition, manipulation. Graham was still in meetings when his assistant rushed in with a tablet. "You're trending again," she whispered. He looked down, saw the photo, and felt the air leave his lungs. Not because he was caught, but because she was. Because the world had found a way to make cruelty look like curiosity. By noon, the library's board received calls. Donors threatened to withdraw funding. Sponsors cited distractions from educational focus. By 2 o'clock, Sadie was called into a small office and told she'd be placed on administrative leave, just until things calmed down. She didn't cry. She didn't argue. She simply nodded, thanked the director, and walked out holding the box that contained everything she loved about her work: photos drawn by children, a stack of thank you cards, and one crayon cat taped to the lid. Outside, cameras waited like scavengers. "Miss Quinn, are you dating him? Did you know he was rich? Are you moving into his estate?" Each flash felt like an accusation, each question a theft. She kept walking. That night, Graham arrived at her apartment. Reporters lined the curb. He didn't care. He got out of his car, coat flapping in the wind, cameras flashing like lightning. He stood in front of her door, calling out softly through the noise. "I can't control what they say, Sadie, but I can stand here, between you and the noise."
Inside, she heard his voice tremble, not the voice of a CEO, but of a man. Her hand touched the doorknob, but she couldn't open it. She whispered through the wood, "Protect your daughters. Please, don't let them get dragged into this." "They already are," he said, "because they miss you, because they ask for you every night." The reporters caught fragments of the conversation, not enough to understand, only enough to speculate. When he finally walked away, the door remained closed, but something in both of them cracked open. The quiet realization that love, once exposed to the world, needs courage to survive.
3 days passed, then 4. The media storm burned hot and fast, then cooled when a new scandal took its place. But for Sadie, silence didn't mean peace. It meant being forgotten. A small life turned into gossip, then discarded. Her apartment grew smaller, her days slower. She stopped opening curtains. Even her rescued dog, Poppy, grew restless, pacing between rooms as if searching for laughter that had gone missing. One morning, a soft knock. No reporters this time, no chaos. Just a piece of paper slipped under the door, wrinkled, uneven, drawn in marker. A purple heart, 3 stick figures, and 4 words in crooked crayon. "We miss you, Miss Sadie." It was signed by Ella and Emma. Tears blurred the paper. She pressed it to her chest and whispered, "I miss you too." That same day, Graham sat at home with the twins. He'd watched them draw that letter with more concentration than he'd ever seen in a boardroom. When they were done, he asked, "What do you want her to know?" Ella had said simply, "That she's our friend, that we didn't forget." He had realized then that children have a way of restoring what adults ruin. That evening, he drove the girls to Sadie's apartment. No cameras followed. He took the side streets, parked far away. They walked the last block holding hands. The old crayon cat was still taped to her door, faded but surviving. He knocked once, twice. Inside, Sadie hesitated. She heard laughter, tiny, pure, familiar. When she opened the door, the twins leapt forward before she could speak. Their little arms wrapped around her legs, anchoring her to life again. "I missed you," she sobbed, kneeling to hold them tight. And then she looked up, and there was Graham, standing quietly in the hallway, his eyes full of apology, not pride. He didn't bring headlines. He just brought my heart, and theirs. She stepped aside. "And come in," she whispered. It was the smallest act of forgiveness, but it was everything. It was winter when they rebuilt the old table, the one from that first dinner where spaghetti sauce became a love language. This time, there were no reservations, no disguises, just family. The twins helped paint the wood white. Sadie brought flowers. Graham brought humility. They ate simple food. They laughed louder. And after the girls went to bed, Graham asked her a question he'd been afraid to voice. "What would you do if you could do anything at all?" Sadie smiled faintly. "I'd build something that gives back what books gave me, hope. A place for kids who have no bedtime stories, no safe corners. I'd call it Story Nest." He nodded. "Then let's build it." No press release, no board approval, just faith. She drew the logo by hand, a tiny bird perched on an open book. He wrote the first check, anonymous. In the months that followed, Story Nest began as a mobile reading van, old, yellow, with shelves lined with donated books. Sadie read in homeless shelters, hospitals, refugee centers. Children who'd never been read to before sat in circles, eyes wide with wonder. She didn't just read, she listened, she remembered their names. When a reporter finally caught on, the headline wasn't about scandal. It was about kindness. The mystery woman creates Story Nest, bringing books to children without homes. The world, for once, began to see her as she truly was. At night, Graham helped load boxes of books. The twins painted tiny birds on the van doors. And sometimes as Sadie read aloud to a crowd of children under a street lamp, he stood at a distance and watched, realizing that wealth wasn't about what you owned, it was what you gave back to the human spirit. 6 months later, the narrative had changed, not because they fought back, but because they lived differently. People began writing about them not as a billionaire and a librarian, but as a family redefining success. Podcasts featured Story Nest. Newspapers ran stories about empathy, not scandal. And the same donors who once withdrew funding now sent handwritten notes of apology and checks to support her cause. Sadie never gloated. She said quietly, "Kindness doesn't need revenge. It just needs time." Graham took that lesson everywhere, into meetings, into fatherhood, into himself. He stopped seeing his company as a fortress and began to see it as a tool. He created scholarships for underprivileged children and asked Sadie to help curate a reading list for every recipient. Their love didn't need attention. It grew in the ordinary, over burnt toast, bedtime stories, and laughter that returned like spring. The girls called her Mama Sadie now, naturally without ceremony. And on the anniversary of Story Nest's first launch, they threw a celebration not at the estate, but in the same park where she had once read to strangers. No security guards, no velvet ropes, just a red door painted on canvas, a reminder of where it all began. When Graham took the stage, he didn't speak about money or legacy. He said, "I used to think love was something that arrived with perfect timing. But love, real love, sits at the wrong table, pays the wrong bill, and still chooses to stay." The crowd stood in silence, not applause, but reverence. And beside him, Sadie smiled not for the cameras, but for the life they had built out of broken things. It began as a whisper, a simple cough from Ella one December night. Nothing alarming, just a child catching a winter cold. But within days, the fever rose, the doctor's tone changed, and in the sterile glow of the hospital hallway, the truth arrived. Pneumonia, complications, uncertainty. Graham's empire could buy machines, specialists, whole wings of hospitals, but not peace, not control, not the ability to watch his child breathe without fear. He sat at her bedside, her tiny hand resting in his palm, monitors blinking rhythmically like heartbeats of machines that were fused to comfort. Sadie never left the room. She read aloud softly, fairy tales, poems, fragments of hope stitched together in words. Sometimes she opened her eyes and whispered, "Read the one about the bird again." The bird from Story Nest, the one that never stopped flying, even in storms. For days they lived between breaths, hospital meals, sleepless nights, hope that cracked and healed in cycles. When the fever finally broke, Sadie collapsed into a chair and wept. Graham reached for her hand, but it wasn't just gratitude. It was surrender to something larger, something humbling. The man who once believed wealth could solve everything had learned to pray, not for miracles, but for mercy. After 3 weeks, they brought Ella home. She was thinner, quieter, but alive. The house filled with the sound of crayons again. Yet something in Graham had changed. He stopped rushing, stopped negotiating every moment of life as if it were a deal to win. At dinner, he told Sadie softly, "I used to think my greatest legacy was what I built. Now I know it's what I keep alive." She smiled through tears, and sometimes it's who we keep alive. Not long after Ella's recovery, the world tested them again. Not with sickness, but with loss of another kind. Graham's mentor, Henry Vaughn, passed away quietly one spring morning. Henry wasn't just a business partner. He'd been like a father after Graham's own had left too soon. A man of few words, but many lessons. The funeral was simple. No grand speeches, no flashing cameras. Just an old jazz record playing softly in the background, Henry's favorite. After the service, Graham stayed behind, standing near the grave as everyone else left. The air smelled faintly of rain and roses. Sadie approached him, her shoes crunching on the gravel. "You okay?" she whispered. He didn't look up. He built everything from nothing, the company, his name, his vision, and I took it all forward, but I never asked him if he was happy. Sadie stood beside him, silent for a while. Then she said,
Maybe you don't measure a life by happiness, Graham. Maybe it's measured by how many people find light because of you. He looked at her, eyes rimmed with fatigue. Then what if all I've done is cast shadows? She took his hand gently. Then you start again. From now, with light. That evening, when they returned home, Graham sat with the twins by the fireplace. "Do you girls know what legacy means?" he asked. Emma tilted her head. "Like when you leave something behind?" He nodded. "Yes, but not just things. Maybe it's stories, or kindness, or someone who remembers you when the world forgets." Ella smiled faintly. "Like Mama Sadie's books." He laughed softly. "Exactly like that." And that night, when everyone was asleep, Graham stood at the window looking out over the city. For the first time in years, he didn't see profits, markets, or headlines. He saw faces of employees, of children from Story Nest, of Sadie reading under a lamplight. He whispered into the dark, "Maybe this is what it means to live forever." Fame is a double-edged ghost. It visits, vanishes, and never says goodbye. By the time Story Nest entered its third year, the world had moved on. New causes replaced it on talk shows, bigger philanthropists made louder promises. But Sadie didn't mind. In truth, she preferred the silence. The quiet of early mornings when she packed the van alone, filling shelves with worn paperbacks and handwritten notes from children she'd once read to. Graham's company faced turbulence that year. A merger gone wrong, a scandal involving distant board members. But he found himself torn between crisis management and keeping his family's small world intact. But in the midst of that chaos, he noticed something strange. He didn't crave control anymore. He craved grounding. He'd go to the park during lunch breaks, just to watch Sadie read to children under a tree. Sometimes no one recognized him. And for the first time, he liked it that way. One night, after another exhausting board meeting, he came home to find Sadie asleep on the couch, a book resting open on her chest. The girls were upstairs, the house dim and quiet. He sat beside her and whispered, "The world can forget us. That's okay, as long as we don't forget what love looks like." She stirred slightly, murmured in her sleep, "Then remember this." He smiled, because he knew he would.
That summer, something remarkable happened. Story Nest received a letter from a young man in Detroit. It read, "When I was 10, your mobile library came to our shelter. You read The Giving Tree and told me that kindness was never wasted. I'm 20 now. I work at a literacy center. I tell the same story every week. I guess your kindness wasn't wasted after all." Sadie cried reading it. Graham did too. That night, they drove to the lake house, the small cottage where everything had begun. The twins were asleep in the back seat, the windows open, the night air cool. When they arrived, Sadie walked down to the dock alone. The moon shimmered across the water like spilled light. Graham followed quietly. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded, tears glistening. "I just keep thinking about how something so small, reading to one child, could change everything. We always think love has to be grand, visible, but maybe it's just this ripples." He looked out across the lake. "Then what we've built, these stories, these children, this family, maybe it's not our legacy. Maybe it's just the beginning." She smiled softly. "And maybe love isn't a story we tell. Maybe it's the one we leave behind." He reached for her hand. The air was silent except for the sound of the wind in the trees, like pages turning in an unseen book. Somewhere far off, a bird called out, soft, insistent, eternal. And in that sound they both understood. The bird from Story Nest never stopped flying. Time has a way of reshaping the strongest men. For years, Graham Westwood had been a fortress, a man of steel decisions and flawless composure. But on an ordinary morning in October, as dawn spilled through the kitchen windows,
His hand trembled as he reached for a cup of coffee. It wasn't much. Just a flicker, a tremor easily dismissed. But Sadie noticed. She always noticed. He brushed it off with a smile. "Just tired," he said. But that afternoon, as he lifted Ella's backpack from the car, his vision blurred, the world tilted slightly, like a photograph slipping out of its frame. The diagnosis came days later. A mild cardiac condition, not life-threatening, but serious enough to force him to stop, to listen. For a man who had spent his entire life racing against the clock, stillness was the hardest medicine. Doctors spoke in gentle tones about stress management, rest, balance. Words he'd offered employees for years, but never granted himself. That night, Sadie found him sitting in the darkened living room, the faint hum of the city beyond the window. She sat beside him quietly. "I'm not afraid of dying," he said. "I'm afraid of not finishing." She turned to him, eyes steady, then finish being alive first. He looked at her, really looked, and realized he'd built empires but forgotten the rhythm of simply breathing in another's presence. And in that moment he made a vow, to live slower, truer, deeper. The next morning he didn't go to the office. He made breakfast instead, burned the first batch of pancakes, laughed about it with the girls, and decided that, perhaps for the first time, the world could wait. Seasons changed softly that year. Winter came, but it didn't freeze them. It softened them. The girls grew taller, their laughter deeper. Story Nest expanded quietly across towns, not as a brand, but as a heartbeat, a movement carried by volunteers who had once been children in those reading circles. Sadie thrived in the quiet rhythm of it all. She no longer chased applause. She chased meaning. She and Graham spent evenings reading together. Rumi, Thoreau, Mary Oliver. Words about stillness, impermanence, and the wild, ordinary beauty of living. But underneath it all, something was shifting inside Graham. Not illness, not fear, but awareness. He was aging. He could feel time brushing its fingertips across his life, reminding him gently that every moment was borrowed. One night, as they sat by the fire, he asked, "Do you think we ever know when we've given enough?" Sadie looked up from her book. "No. I think we just love until it doesn't feel like effort anymore." He smiled faintly. "Then you've given everything." That winter, they began what Sadie called the ritual of release. Every month they donated something dear. Not money, but memories. Graham gave away his first watch. Sadie donated her childhood novels. The girls parted with old toys, one by one. "It hurts," Ella said once. Sadie nodded. "That's how you know it mattered." By spring, their house felt lighter, quieter, and somehow more alive. What they were doing wasn't letting go. It was making room. And somewhere in that sacred emptiness, they found peace.
It was the first real storm of summer, thunder rolling across the city, rain pounding against glass. Sadie had been working late at the library, sorting donations for Story Nest's new expansion. Graham insisted she stay safe until it passed. But the call came anyway. A driver who had skidded off the road near the old bridge. The rain blurred everything into gray, lights, sirens, prayers. By the time Graham reached the hospital, the hallways were too familiar, the same antiseptic scent, the same cold chairs, the same helplessness that had once nearly broken him. Sadie's injuries weren't grave, but the doctors were cautious. "She hit her head," one said. "We'll monitor her through the night." He nodded silently, his throat tight. Through the glass he saw her sleeping, her face calm, her hair damp against the pillow. For hours he sat there, unmoving. Outside, the world kept roaring. Inside, time folded into silence. When she woke, she smiled faintly. "You're still here," she whispered. "Always," he answered. She reached out, her fingers trembling, touching his. "You look scared," she murmured. "I almost lost you," he said. She smiled. "Then you'd have to carry both our kindnesses." He swallowed hard.
What does that mean? It means love doesn't die when we do. It multiplies. You'll see. He didn't understand then, not fully, but he would. 2 years later, Graham sat by the same window where everything had begun. The girls were off to college now, strong, compassionate, steady. Story Nest had become a nationwide foundation. And Sadie? She was still the heart of it all, though her health had begun to waver. The doctors called it autoimmune decline, a quiet thief that stole energy but not spirit. She moved slower, spoke softer, yet her eyes were the same, luminous with life. One evening, she sat at the table surrounded by letters from children, volunteers, teachers. She looked up and said, "We did it! We turned love into a library!" He smiled gently. "You did." "No," she whispered. "We! I gave it words, you gave it wings." That night, she asked for something unusual. "Play that record, the one from Henry's funeral," she said. As the jazz filled the room, she leaned against his shoulder. "Promise me something," she whispered, "that when I go, and I will, you won't build statues or halls in my name. Just plant a tree, something that keeps growing without applause." He tried to speak, but his voice broke. She smiled softly. "We'll see each other again. Maybe not in time, but in kindness." She passed a few months later, quietly, in her sleep. No headlines, no chaos, just dawn light spilling across her face, as if the sun itself had come to say goodbye. At her memorial, children from Story Nest read their favorite books aloud under an oak tree. Graham sat beneath it, hands clasped, eyes lifted toward the sky. And in the rustling leaves, he could almost hear her voice. Love doesn't die. It multiplies. That day he understood what she meant. The morning after Sadie's memorial, the cottage was still. Wind chimes trembled in the soft spring breeze, whispering like a soul that refused to leave. Graham walked through the quiet rooms she once filled, her teacup still by the window, her handwriting still pinned to the refrigerator. Kindness first, always. Outside, in the garden, lay the oak sapling she had chosen months earlier. It waited, roots bound in burlap, ready for the earth. He remembered her final words. "Plant a tree, something that keeps growing without applause." So he did. The soil was cold and damp beneath his hands. His body trembled, not from age, but from something heavier. Memory. As he pressed the earth down around the roots, he whispered, "You're still here. You'll always be here." He stood for a long while, until the sky shifted from pale gold to soft gray. Behind him, two familiar voices approached, the twins, now young women, holding a small plaque. They had flown home quietly the night before. Ella knelt beside him. "We made this," she said. On the bronze plaque were simple words, "For Sadie Quinn, who taught the world to read love." Graham's voice broke. She'd have laughed at that. Emma smiled through tears. "She would have cried first." They placed the plaque at the base of the tree. No speeches, no press, no audience. Only family, soil, and the sacred quiet of remembrance. That evening, as twilight deepened, the first stars appeared, faint, trembling, infinite. And somewhere between sky and earth, Graham finally understood what Sadie meant, that some loves don't end, they take root. A year later, the oak had grown tall enough to cast a long shadow across the cottage yard. Birds nested in its branches. Children from nearby schools came every weekend to read beneath it. They called it the Story Tree. Word of it spread, not through headlines, but through whispers. Teachers spoke of it. Librarians framed its story in their classrooms. Volunteers began planting their own story trees across cities. It wasn't a movement. It was a miracle. Quiet, organic, unstoppable. Graham traveled often now, visiting these new roots of Sadie's dream.
In Detroit, a group of teenagers had turned an abandoned bus into a rolling library, painted with her words. Kindness first, always. In Portland, a vegan cafe donated proceeds every week to fund children's books for shelters. In every city, her spirit lived on, not in photos or plaques, but in actions, small, gentle actions that made people believe again. Once, during a visit to Chicago, a little girl tugged at Graham's sleeve. "Are you Mr. Westwood?" she asked shyly. He smiled. "I used to be." She held up a worn copy of The Giving Tree. "She told us about this book," the girl whispered. "The lady from Story Nest. She said giving makes you grow." Graham felt his eyes sting. She was right. When he left that day, the girl ran after him, shouting, "Tell her thank you!" He looked up at the sky and whispered, "I already have."
It was autumn when the twins returned home for good. Ella had become a teacher, Emma a social worker. Both carried Sadie's light in different forms, one through words, the other through healing. The cottage was still their sanctuary. The oak now towered over the house, its branches stretching like open arms. One evening they gathered by the fire. Graham, his hair silvered and his voice gentler, sat with them as they looked through an old box of letters, Sadie's letters. She had written dozens before she passed, each addressed to a different person, volunteers, children, friends. And one envelope had their names written together, "For my 3 hearts." Inside, her words flowed like music. "If you're reading this, it means I've gone somewhere you can't follow yet. But please remember, you don't need to find me. Just look for the smallest good thing in every day, and that's where I'll be. In laughter, in books, in trees. Don't make monuments, make moments. Love, Sadie." They sat in silence, the only sound the fire's soft crackle. Then Emma whispered, "She's right here." Graham nodded. She never left. Later that night, after the twins went to bed, he walked outside to the oak again. The moon hung low, and the wind rustled softly through the leaves. He reached out, touching the bark. "Thank you," he murmured. And for the briefest instant, he swore he heard her laughter in the wind, low, kind, eternal. In the final decade of his life, Graham Westwood withdrew from the public eye completely. He sold most of his holdings, leaving the majority to the Story Nest Foundation. Reporters called it philanthropy, but for him, it was pilgrimage, the last act of gratitude for a life redeemed by love. He moved permanently to the cottage by the oak. Every morning he made tea for 2. Every evening he read aloud from Sadie's favorite books, though no one sat beside him, or maybe someone always did. On his 78th birthday, Ella and Emma organized a gathering under the tree. Children from all over came to read, draw, and laugh. At sunset, Graham stood up to speak, frail but steady. People ask what love leaves behind. Some think it's memory. Others think it's legacy. But I think love leaves light, the kind that doesn't fade when people do. Sadie taught me that. She taught me that kindness is the one thing you can give away and still keep forever. He smiled, looking toward the branches above. The world will forget our names, but if it remembers our kindness, even once, then we've done enough. When night fell, lanterns glowed across the yard, swaying gently in the wind. Children's laughter echoed like the heartbeat of something sacred, something infinite. And under the canopy of stars, Graham closed his eyes, listening to the leaves whisper overhead. Each rustle sounded like her voice, not gone, but everywhere. The final morning of Graham Westwood's life was so still it felt scripted by the heavens. Sunlight spilled softly through the kitchen window, landing on 2 teacups, one chipped, one whole. the same set Sadie used to use. Steam curled upward, twisting like memory. He moved slowly now, his once steady hands marked by age and tremor, but his spirit remained fierce, alive with gratitude. He walked to the porch, where the oak tree cast long shadows across the lawn, now a sanctuary for every wandering soul who needed rest. Children from nearby towns had begun visiting regularly, leaving books and notes at its roots. Some called it Sadie's Tree, others the Listening Oak. But to Graham, it was simply her, still growing, still giving. He sat down on the porch swing, his favorite spot, and opened a weathered leather journal. On its first page were the words she once wrote to him. "When the world forgets your name, may it still remember your kindness." He smiled faintly. "It will, Sadie. You made sure of that." The air smelled of lavender and soil. In the distance he could hear children laughing, a sound that felt like life itself. He closed his eyes. The wind carried the soft tinkle of the old chimes she hung years ago. It was the same song that played the night she said, "Don't live trying to be remembered, Graham. Live trying to remember how to love." And that was how he left this world, not in loneliness, but in light. A quiet exhale, a peaceful smile, and then stillness. When the twins arrived later that afternoon, the tea was still warm. They found him on the porch, the journal open to a fresh page. On it, written in his shaky hand, were 6 simple words. Tell them it was all real. No grand estate, no last will read in marble halls. Just that. A message, and the oak tree swaying above him like a benediction.
The funeral was held beneath the oak, just as he had wanted. No black suits, no headlines, only people who had been touched, quietly, by the light of their love. Former volunteers from Story Nest stood side by side with children who were now grown, teachers, nurses, bus drivers, a mosaic of kindness gathered beneath one sky. The twins spoke not of his wealth, but of his humility. He was a man who learned to listen, Emma said softly. And he taught us that the truest love doesn't need witnesses, added Ella. When the ceremony ended, the children placed books beneath the tree, picture books, poetry, dog-eared novels as offerings. A little boy placed a note that read, "Thank you for making people believe again." As the sun began to set, its rays filtered through the oak leaves, casting moving patterns of light across the crowd. Someone whispered, "It looks like the tree is glowing." And it was. It always did at sunset. "Sadie's doing," they said, or perhaps just love made visible. Over the next months, Story Nest grew beyond anything Graham or Sadie could have imagined. Volunteers multiplied, communities built libraries in forgotten towns, and a new initiative, Kindness First, brought mobile reading vans to rural schools. Everywhere her words echoed, "Books feed the mind, kindness feeds the soul." But the most powerful thing wasn't what they built. It was what they became, a movement of hearts, not hands. No hierarchy, no fame, no logo grand enough to contain it. Just people helping people, quietly. Because kindness, once set in motion, doesn't die. It ripples, invisible and eternal, like sunlight refracting through time. 20 years passed. The world had changed, faster, louder, more digital, yet beneath all the noise, certain stories endured. On the anniversary of Story Nest's founding, a crowd gathered beneath the now massive oak. Its roots stretched wide, its branches touched the sky. Children climbed its limbs, families picnicked beneath it. A plaque now stood beside the bronze one, etched with a new line, "For Graham and Sadie Westwood, who proved that love, once planted, never dies." Among the crowd was a young woman named Harper, a teacher from Brooklyn. She had grown up in a foster home, one of the first children Story Nest ever reached. Now she stood at the podium, her voice trembling with emotion. "I never met them," she said, "but because of them, I became a teacher. Because of them, I learned that one small act of kindness can echo longer than a lifetime." She held up a worn children's book, The Giving Tree, the same edition Sadie once read to strangers in libraries. "My students think this book is about loss," she continued, "but I tell them it's about love that doesn't ask to be seen." As the audience fell silent, a breeze passed through the oak, scattering golden leaves. And for a fleeting moment, it felt as if the air itself whispered. When the crowd dispersed, Sadie stayed behind. She knelt by the roots and placed the book there, whispering, "Thank you." The wind lifted a single leaf, carrying it into the sky, weightless, timeless, and somewhere in that invisible space between memory and eternity, two souls walked together. No longer bound by time or body, just pure light, pure kindness, pure love. Because in the end, immortality isn't about being remembered. It's about becoming the reason someone else chooses kindness. And that's what they did. Graham and Sadie's story was never about wealth or romance or even loss. It was about awakening, the rediscovery of the human heart in a world that had forgotten how to listen. Their lives became a quiet scripture of compassion that one dinner table, one moment of humility, one act of truth can still change everything. So if you ever pass a tree and hear the soft murmur of leaves, pause for a moment. You might just be hearing them, two ordinary souls who reminded the world that love, once given, never leaves. Because the truest stories never end. They live on, in kindness, in compassion, in you.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a like and leave a kind comment. To help the channel stay motivated to create more great videos, please hit the subscribe button. Wishing you happiness and peace in the light and love of God.